Okay, so in this section, we have to kind of start to begin to see the effects of the 1920s. We talked about all those great changes in society and in the culture and things like that. But what we now have to look at is how did that cause what we see in the 1930s, because it will greatly affect what we go into in the next decade. So we have to first go over the business cycle. Now, the business cycle is something that's happening all the time. It cannot be stopped. The time that we're in each piece of the business cycle may change. There may be longer periods of prosperity, recession, depression, recovery, but it is constantly going. It is something that we cannot stop. Uh, so let's look at what these different categories are. First, we have prosperity. This is when we see prosperity, this is great. This is the 1920s. We got lots of business activity. We got lots of production. People are buying and selling goods. Wages are great. Prices are great. Profits are high. Everybody's got a job, so unemployment is low. Sounds wonderful. But prosperity is followed by recession. This is when we're going to start to see business activity slow down a little bit. There's a little bit less production. People are not buying in as big of numbers, they're not selling in as big of numbers. Wages, prices, profits are going to start to fall. And as all of this happens, as people buy less, as we sell less, as we produce less, that means we don't need as many workers, so unemployment is going to be on the rise. Recession leads us into depression. Depression is when activity is very, very low, almost at a standstill. Very little is being produced, very little is bought and sold. Because of that, when businesses aren't doing well, they have to drop wages. They're going to drop prices to try to encourage people to buy, but profits are going to remain low. Unemployment is going to be extremely high during a depression. Many people will be out of work. But depression is always followed by recovery. Business activity starts to improve, production, buying, selling, it all rises, along with wages, prices, profits. And unemployment is going to start to fall. And that leads us right back into prosperity, and the whole cycle begins again. Now, when we think about that business cycle, we have to think about the 1920s into the 1930s and subsequently into the 1940s as well. But to understand where we're coming from, let's look at the background here. In the 1920s, the Republican Party had been in power. We had Harding, then we had Coolidge. The nation on the outside appears to be doing very well. The stock market's on the rise. The Republican Party is going to take credit for what we call a bull market and the increase in American greed, that consumer revolution. Now, maybe you've heard the bull versus the bear economy before. A bull economy is a rise in stock prices. People are buying in the market, but they might be buying on margin. Buying on margin is basically like buying with monopoly money. You don't really have it. What you do if you're buying on margin and you want to buy stocks in the stock market is to go to somebody called a broker. You have maybe $100, but you want to buy into the company of Apple, and their stock price might be over $1,000. So you would borrow the rest of the money from a broker, and you would buy a stock, but you would wait and try to maybe sell that stock to pay back your broker and make some money. But buying on margin is going to get us into some pretty big trouble. A bear economy is when we see a very steady drop in stock prices. This would be an absolute disaster for those people who borrowed money to buy stocks. When you borrow money to buy a stock in the hopes that that stock price would increase and it doesn't increase, not only do you lose your money, but you don't make enough money to pay back for the money that you borrowed. This is the story of the 1920s. We have a bull economy where Americans are going to be incredibly comfortable with buying stock prices at a high price with money that they don't have. And that's going to push us into a bear economy very quickly. The biggest problem with our stock market is that prices were rising very quickly, and people, businesses, couldn't even keep track of what the stock prices were, which means they didn't really have a base in reality. And the nation is going to be headed for the greatest depression that we've ever faced. Some other factors that push us into the Great Depression are going to be this gap between the rich and the poor. The gap between the rich and the poor had become incredibly wide. During the 1920s, the rich were becoming richer while the industrial workers were becoming poorer. We've heard these statistics before. The Gilded Age had it happen. The wealthiest 1% in 1929 earned the same as 42% of the population combined. Those with less were the ones who were borrowing money to buy the items that they couldn't afford. The rich aren't going to be buying enough, keeping the economy afloat. We require the rich to spend their money in order to have our economy be successful. There has to be real money floating around in the economy while other people are borrowing. The problem that we see with this gap between the rich and the poor is that too many Americans did not have the money to buy what they needed or wanted, and they were very comfortable with borrowing it, which meant that we have majority of Americans in a lot of debt, and that's dangerous. Another cause of the Great Depression is going to be overproduction. Now, this is pretty easy to understand. During the 1920s, businesses are going to be producing like no tomorrow. They have the ability to produce in mass quantities. So they do that. Think of Ford with the Model T. Businesses are going to be producing more than what is being sold, and that's dangerous. When businesses cut back on production, that means that there are less workers needed. When there's less workers needed, that means that they fire people. Americans at the same time are going to be buying these big items on credit because they couldn't afford them. Products like automobiles, appliances, radios, and even stocks. Many of these items are going to be bought using that method of installment buying, where you put a little bit of money down and you pay on it month to month. The reason this is going to be made possible is because everybody could get approval for a loan. They weren't discriminating against anybody, and this encourages people to live beyond their means. Now, the problem with this is if people are buying with money that they don't have, companies look at their sales and say, "Oh, everybody's buying it. We should make more of it. We should keep producing." But they aren't really getting all of the money at that time of purchase. They don't really have real funds to make more. So, this idea of overproduction really comes from that initial consumer revolution where people were purchasing a lot of goods without the money to do so. At the same time, we're going to see a significant underconsumption. Okay, businesses are producing too much. We just said they were overproducing, and they're doing so because people that didn't have money are spending spending more money than they have. Uh, but what we're going to see start to happen is that that's the middle class that's buying on credit, overextending themselves to buy those goods that they can't afford. But then we're going to have two chunks of people on either side of that. We have people that don't have money and they're not spending money because they don't have it on those extra goods. And we also have the upper class that's saving their money, not putting it back into the economy. And the middle class that's buying with money that they don't have really equals out to underconsumption because the majority of the population is going to be the ones that don't have a ton of money that aren't buying anything. And the ones that really could make these significant purchases to keep up with this overproduction, the upper class, the super wealthy, they just aren't spending money because they don't care. They're saving it, they're greedy. So, what we see in the 1920s leading into the 1930s is a general underconsumption in America. So, we have the businesses overproducing and we have the consumers underconsuming. That's going to equal overspending for the businesses. And that means they're going to have to fire people and they're not going to rehire them for a while. The other cause of the Great Depression, banking practices. The banks did not discriminate on who got a loan in the 1920s. They were like Oprah on her favorite day. Everybody gets a loan. If you ask for it, you get it. Doesn't matter if you can pay it back. Doesn't even matter if you have a job. They weren't checking. For bank customers, what this means is that the banks are doing some pretty shady stuff. The reason that banks can exist is because they have money in their bank, okay? At the time, banks were doing with the money that they had whatever they wanted to. So if I went and made a deposit of $1,000 in the bank and the next person in line wanted a loan for $1,000, the bank would give them my $1,000. And if I got in line after that person and asked for the money that I just put in the bank, they wouldn't be able to give it to me. So when times got tough and people, the bank customers, went back to the bank to get their money, there wasn't any money there for them. So people lost all of their money. And the reason that this happened is because the government was taking that hands-off approach. They were saying, meh, hands off, laissez-faire, that's good for us. So the very few regulations put on banks allowed them to do with whatever they wanted with the money that people were trusting them with in their banks. Banks also used the money that people saved there to invest in the stock market. Because remember, I said successful banks run off of how much money they have in their bank. So the banks tried to make more money by investing customer money in the stock market. But when the stock market isn't doing so well, that means that they lost customers' money. And the customers had no idea that this was happening. So when banks made bad investments and they were forced to close their doors because they didn't have money anymore, the money that you saved in that bank was just gone. And they didn't have to pay you back because there was no regulations. Sometimes there would be rumors of banks making bad investments and that they might be closing their doors soon. And what they would do is send people into a panic and they would rush to the bank to get their money before the banks would close. And whether that bank was really going to close or not, they definitely were after those rumors started because they wouldn't have any more money. Once they gave out the last of what they had, the bank would close. And if you weren't there to get your money, well, then so be it. You didn't get any. So your entire savings could just disappear and you would have no idea how or why. You would just be out that money. Another big cause of the Great Depression is going to be the Dust Bowl. A great read to give you some idea of the Dust Bowl is going to be John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. Okay, that's a great read describing exactly what was happening out west. Where this comes from, though, is farmers are going to produce a lot during World War One. Remember, they're producing for the United States and they're producing for all of Europe because we needed to. Europe couldn't do it themselves. The war had destroyed their land. We have to do it for them. But after the war, farmers are still producing like we're in war because they had bought all of this fancy, expensive equipment with loans to keep up with production demands, and they have to pay those loans. They have to cover those debts. So they're going to plant more crops, such as wheat, and try to sell that. But what's happening all at the same time is that they're overproducing, so the price of their good is coming down, and they're ruining the land at the same time. Wheat crops were depleting the soil of its nutrients, making the land unsuitable for planting. So they would have product right now, but it wouldn't be worth a whole lot. And even if they did move it, it wasn't enough to pay their loans. Farmers are going to take out more loans from the banks to buy more equipment and more land because the land that they had, they deprived it of all of its nutrients and they couldn't produce anymore. But that's going to create a problem here because not only did they have the loans that they had to pay from before, but now they have new loans and the price of their product is going down. Add on top of that the just average conditions of the Great Plains, the drought, on top of the poor farming practices, and you're going to have soil that is incredibly unfit for farming. Cue in the Dust Bowl, which is exactly what it sounds like. Now, I know this was all pretty negative, but these are some of the major causes of the Great Depression. Next time we come together, we're going to look at a few more causes that lead us into the actual stock market crashing. Don't forget about your homework and let me know of any questions.